I have sculpted about 6 full clay ball-jointed doll heads and bodies now, as well as about 7 3D sculpted bodies and 30 or so completed heads. Not all were released, of course. I also made hundreds of practice heads, parts, and other props in clay and 3D software. With all this under my belt, and 3 years into my doll making journey, I wanted to make this video, highlighting what I believe are the main differences, similarities, and the pros and cons of both digital and traditional sculpting. So with that, let's get into it. Alright, so let's take a look at the starting costs of making a doll. So for this, I'm going to be discounting the cost of hooks, elastics, and magnets, which will be about the same in whatever medium you choose. With clay sculpting, you need a few things to get started. A few basic tools from Amazon or a local craft shop will run you $20 to $100, depending on the quality and the amount of tools you get. However, I have sculpted dolls using chopsticks and just my hands before. To what success, I don't know, but the tools certainly make things easier. You also need at least one type of clay, which will cost you $50 to $100 for an MSD size doll. That's 1/4 scale if you're new. For finishing, I went through much more sandpaper and primer with my clay BJDs than with my 3D sculpted dolls as well. About 5 coats of primer to the 3D versions to the 3. A can of primer will also run you between $10 and $25 depending. In my experience, one can gets you about 2 coats. However, don't think digital sculpting is cheaper because there's no clay. You need a robust computer or tablet to run the software, which will usually run you at least $500. That's really lowballing it too. I use an iPad Pro to sculpt on because my regular iPad Air could not handle anything detailed or multiple doll parts at once. So you really need something good. Then you need to pay for the software, which can be as little as $0 for something like Blender, or up to $300 a month for something like Maya. The free or cheaper options are going to be more limited, but I work around this using multiple software types for different functions. You'll also need to consider the cost of 3D printing resin for a few prototypes, as well as a printer and maintenance and electricity for the printer. You can also pay someone to print for you, but this cost does add up if you need a couple iterations of your doll, which you usually will. Alright, so let's talk about actually sculpting now. And of course, we're going to start with initial shaping. But before I get super into the difference, I want to mention that 3D modeling and 3D sculpting are slightly different. 3D modeling is basically an umbrella term used for a bunch of techniques for forming 3-dimensional objects with computer software. By gradually building an item by slowly adding polygons or small blocks with 3 or more vertices, think cube, sphere, cone, cylinder, mesh. You'll hear most doll artists refer to this as the block out. 3D sculpting, on the other hand, is the process that involves the artist manipulating the polygon mesh of the item just like a clay sculptor. We'll shape, stretch, carve, cut, slice it with digital tools, which results in a very high quality rendition of a digital object. Basically what I'm saying is, when you make a doll digitally from scratch, you'll need to do both. While traditionally sculpting with clay, you can certainly block out the doll, but many don't. Instead, they dive right in for a shape and then build out. There are some who will block out a doll and build up, making base shapes out of tubes and spheres. But many artists will go for the basic shape right away, some even sculpting the body or head in its entirety and then cutting up into pieces later. Likewise, some people will just over-sculpt and add too much clay so that they can carve down the shape. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's all down to personal preference. The next topic is sculpting limitations. Physics. With clay sculpting, we are way more limited to what we can physically do and see with those teeny tiny little details. With 3D sculpts, you can zoom in and out of the tiniest corners of the doll to create the detail you want without straining your eyes and fingers in the process. However, the caveat to this is that real-world clay piece is so much easier to joint fit, test, and correct issues with, at least in my experience. I found it much more natural to shape and bring an organic shape to life. By this, I mean I found the doll had more personality from the get-go. Joint fit and movement in 3D is more hypothetical. Sometimes I would make joints I thought would be great, but they'd come out terrible, and way too limited in movement for my taste. Before, I might make a quick joint and it just work randomly. A lot of this is just learning from trial and error. Teeny tip, I use Blender to view how my joints fit in the socket and visualize the movement using the X-ray vision setting. You can learn more about this in my joint fit video. So yeah, with clay sculpting, you're going to have an easier time naturally feeling out how the joint should fit and move without having to wait super long in between printing sessions. There's going to be more asymmetries, but many people will find this charming when it's not too apparent or overabundant. After all, real people are very rarely, if ever, perfectly symmetrical. Following this, with clay dolls, you can see joint fit, but you can also see bumps, lumps, and obvious mistakes. Very easily, you're holding the object in your hand, you can see it in natural lighting, it's much easier to pick out issues. With a 3D sculpted doll in software, it's actually way harder to see the bumps and lumps until it's printed. Or silly mistakes like forgetting a neck channel. I totally did that once. And sadly, at this point, you've printed and your resin has been wasted and you have an unusable part. Another teeny hint for 3D sculpting. I recommend switching between a matte cap and a contrasted lighting view to help find issues before printing. Try turning up the reflectance and glossiness of your material as well to determine if your lines are smooth. I think the most obvious limitation, and the one we all think of right away between 3D sculpting and clay sculpting, is symmetry and scalability. With your 3D sculpted doll, you'll only need to sculpt and joint one base arm and leg. So that's one forearm, one elbow, one bicep, one thigh, one knee, one calf. This is also true of hands and feet, unless you want more than one type of hand or foot. All you have to do once you're finished is duplicate and mirror the object. It is undeniable that a clay doll requires way more effort on this front, since each limb and extremity and joint will need to be sculpted, jointed, and made symmetrical individually. And as far as scaling, being able to offer micros or tiny versions of my sculpts would be near impossible with a clay doll, but recreating the same face and body sculpt and jointing in a different scale is a huge challenge. Sculpting the doll in the first place is a labor of love and hugely time-consuming, but trying to recreate that doll only a quarter of the size and retain the detail would be an insane challenge and take much, much longer, and the result would never be as precise as with 3D sculpting. Whew, that was a lot of info dumping. Let's take a pause here, take a breath, take a break, and let's check out Doll of the Week. This week's Doll of the Week goes to Beast and Babes BJD, who recently got a hollow full set from my summer stock sale. I was honestly so happy Beast and Babes was able to get her. She's been a longtime supporter and such a lovely person in this community. I hope you love her so much, and I'm so excited for you to have her and to share her. Also, we're combo breaking from this bit because Instagram is making it so hard for me to see your photos. I would love, of course, if you use the hashtag TeenyTinkersDolls and tag me, but I have also caved and created a Discord community, link in the description, with a Teeny Tinkers Doll share channel to share photos of your dolls. This server is also making it much easier for me to chat with all of you and get opinions on videos, dolls, and more, as well as just build a community. It's really great. Be sure to check it out. But with all that, let's get back to the video. Alright, let's talk accessibility. The accessibility of sculpting can be looked at with a few different lenses. The upstart cost of 3D sculpting will definitely be higher if you don't have the materials already. By that, meaning a device which supports the software. However, in terms of physical accessibility, 3D sculpting is, in my opinion, more feasible for people with vision impairments, unsteady hands, chronic pain, or anything else which could prevent them from working with firm clay or holding tiny tools for very long periods of time. Also, if you're not printing and sanding the dolls yourself, 3D sculpting is definitely better for people with dust sensitivity, asthma, or other respiratory issues. Another factor is location. 3D sculpting can be done literally anywhere you can have a tablet. You can sculpt in the car, the living room sofa, in a bed, or if you're me, your favorite egg chair. I sculpted a clay doll in bed once. I would strongly not recommend that. You pretty much need a dedicated work area to keep your doll clean and your dust manageable. If you are in a space-limited situation like a small apartment, this may not be possible. Alright, let's talk toughness. Clay is way more fragile than resin, especially for small parts like fingers, ears, joint sockets. I do use wire armature for these small parts with clay, which makes them a bit sturdier, but they're still prone to cracking, chipping, and crumbling. Clay parts are especially susceptible to breaking under stringing pressure, Dremel, or drill use, and of course falls and drops. 3D sculpted dolls are much hardier, as long as the resin's properly cured. Uncured resin can leak, seep, and of course warp. When I got my first hollow samples I had printed back in the day, this was the case. Many were sticky and misshapen and required much more UV exposure to make them solid. If cured properly, they are much tougher to break and you can test string them very snugly without fear of cracking them. You will get some powdering where the joint rubs, but that's about it. Of course, my experience is with polymer clays, air dry clays, and stone clays. I am sure there are tougher options you could use. If you have a suggestion, please drop it in the comments. Also, hey everyone! Winter is coming, and so is giveaway season. Early 2024, I will hopefully be having a lot of giveaways. Why hopefully? Well, the giveaways are goal-based. The first goal I'm trying to reach is 10,000 subs on this YouTube channel, Teeny Tinkers. The second goal I'm trying to reach is 1,000 subscribers on Teenier Tinkers, my second and more casual and slightly collector channel. Finally, I'm also trying to hit 10,000 on TikTok. If all three goals are hit by the end of 2023, I believe December 31st at 11:59 p.m., I will be adding bonus prizes. I would super love if you helped me reach this goal. I know that can feel like there's always a catch to giveaways, but they are expensive and time-consuming to have. Hitting these goals helps me grow and gives me more opportunity to give back to you. You can see more details of the giveaway on my website, which I will link below. I believe we can make this happen together. Okay, but let's back it up. By that, I mean, let's talk backups. My least favorite thing about clay sculpting is absolutely the anxiety I feel around having no backup. You have the doll in front of you, and those are the pieces. If they crack, they may need a lengthy repair or for you to start over. With digital sculpting, you can save your piece in versions, which I recommend, and also undo mistakes. All of that definitely helps in the process of making your doll. But even more so, my biggest fear is sending a clay doll to the caster. With the clay BJD, they are typically one of a kind unless you cast one in resin for yourself first. Which means, again, they're more fragile. If it arrives broken, some casters can repair minor damages for you. Some will send the doll back to you to repair, and then you have to ship it back again. This can be super stressful and very time-consuming, as well as very expensive. International shipping is no joke. And if the doll gets lost in the mail, that could be months or years of work lost. I feel devastated just thinking about it. With a 3D sculpted doll, pieces are typically easier to repair since chips are easier to fix than crumbled bits. As well, some casters offer print services and can print broken parts for you again, or even your entire doll. Another teeny tip. When you add up the cost of printing, primer, packaging, and shipping, it is quite comparable in most cases to paying for the print service. However, with the print service, you do save time and stress and you are ensured the doll will get safely to the caster. However, you cannot ensure that it is finished in the way that you want it to be finished unless your caster is fabulous like mine and sends you a ton of progress pictures. Also, if you do decide to finish and send the doll yourself, if it gets lost in the mail, you can print another. While it's a pain and it is expensive, it is so much better than losing the doll entirely. Okay, so we've taken a good look at the differences and the pros and cons of clay sculpting versus traditional sculpting. Let's talk about some things that are kind of the same. Okay, one that actually surprised me a bit was resin bloat versus polymer clay warping. When I 3D sculpt and print a joint, I typically print it at 98% of the total size of the rest of the doll. So basically, all parts are at 100%, but knee and elbow joints I'll print at 98%. This is because when you print, you can get something called resin bloat, which makes the pieces a hair too big. Joints that are too big simply don't fit or function. But I was surprised to find this is the same with polymer clay, but kind of the opposite. My joint sockets would tighten and shrink a few millimeters, just enough to make the joint too large. I think you could correct this by baking the socket with a wooden bead the same size as the joint in it and then popping it out after. Also, let's talk about time spent. For myself, making a doll in clay and in 3D took roughly the same amount of time, all things considered. With Polly, my most recent polymer clay BJD, I spent about 51 hours on her initial sculpting. Then I spent another 30, yes, 30, on smoothing and finishing work. Also, my hands have never been so sore as after 4 days of consecutive sanding and primering. In contrast with, say, Junie, for example, on the petite body, I spent about 20 hours on her initial sculpt. Then another 30 making subsequent versions to correct the aesthetic or mobility issues prior to creating the physical doll. But the real time killer was prototyping. Printing, washing, curing, removing supports, dealing with misprints. You end up spending another 30 hours just prototyping and modifying the prints to see if things can work better. Adjust the 3D sculpt and print again. All in all, it ends up working about the same. Another similarity was the learning curve. Now, what you're learning is very different, or kind of different, but 3D sculpting and clay sculpting have what I believe is a similar learning curve. For 3D sculpting, learning all of the tools in the software or softwares, plating, supporting, and learning how to use a resin printer, and especially avoiding weird issues and having to troubleshoot what the heck is happening, takes a lot of time. I definitely recommend starting out with a beginner's course on the particular software you're going to be using. There's a lot of studying and memorization and learning through trial and error. But with clay, I feel like while the sculpting itself is more intuitive, getting clay to do what you want it to do and using the physical tools is a lot of work. This one feels more like muscle memory to me. I have never felt more clumsy-fingered than when sculpting with clay. I am heavy and shaky-handed by nature, and learning to focus and have patience and use the tools properly is really hard. In my opinion, the effort of learning the skills is about the same. The good news is some skills are transferable. For example, anatomy skills. Super transferable. Knowing where bones, muscles, and tendons go, as well as things like proportions and joint movement, is helpful no matter how you're making your doll. I found that working with clay helps me appreciate the more smooth and simple lines of the body and face, while 3D sculpting has helped me learn more about detailing and muscle placement and movement. There is no right or wrong way to make a doll, short of recasting or directly copying another's work, of course. The medium and materials you use are solely based on your preference, likes, and limitations. There is a lot of skill needed to make a doll, no matter how you make it. Some skills are the same, some are different. All sculpting, all art is valid, digital or traditional. There are pros and cons to either form of doll making. Through my doll making journey, I have learned that my preference is still in 3D sculpting my dolls. I personally like the scalability, accessibility, and having backups. These are things that are super important to me, although your priorities might be different. But I do find clay sculpting meditative and challenging, so I'm going to continue using it to practice as a means of developing my skills and keeping it fresh. I also like to use it to help me create new characters. This is how Clover came to be, after all. Alright, my takeaway here is I challenge all of you to try sculpting something. If not to make your own doll, to appreciate the skill and work it takes to do so, and hopefully have a little fun along the way. If you do, I would love to see what you make. You can, of course, tag me on Instagram, but I have also created a Discord server, as mentioned, and it does also have an art share channel. I would love if you joined my little community over there. Thank you to everybody watching this video and for supporting me and my art. It truly means the world. If you're already subscribed, thanks so much for subscribing, and if you're new here, I hope you like the content and consider subscribing. As always, I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye!